Hello, everybody. Call this meeting of the New Shoreham Town Council to order. Today is Wednesday, October 25th, 2023. It is 1 p.m. Welcome to the folks who will be watching at YouTube. It strikes me that this is likely to be one that gets a fairly high number of views on YouTube. Just for everyone's background to repeat, I think the town retained cultural heritage partners close to 3 years ago, right? Because I think it was maybe my first meeting on the council, darn close to it. I think in retrospect, that was it was very helpful to have experts engaged in a process that for a layman was about as clear as mud, largely sort of it has struck me largely building a regulatory structure on the fly, which is not a criticism. It's just, when you're trying to move things along quickly, you don't have all the opportunity to perfect a regulatory or permitting process that you might have on some other issues. So that has been very helpful. We're in a place on the timeline where the community is going to have to be pretty quickly making some decisions about what the community wants its stance to be. And part of that effort is to hold this meeting today to have the folks from Cultural Heritage Partners sort of give a status presentation on sort of where we are, what's likely to happen next, et cetera, et cetera. With us today are Greg Werkheiser, Will. I put myself on the spot all the time. Will Cook and I'm so sorry, Claire. I apologize. I'm going to turn unless Neil and Sven have any comments. I'll turn the mic over to Greg, Will, or Claire, whomever is kicking off. And then following that presentation, we'll have Q&A, public comment, et cetera. That's that. So anyway, yeah, then we're going into closed session to talk about potential regulatory appeal strategies. Oh, thank you. Thank you, Neil. Martha just came down with a cold and is really not feeling well, so she'll be watching, I'm sure, online. Molly unfortunately had something come up of a personal nature that so that she couldn't come today. Thank you for reminding me of that, Neil. I always forget that. So Sven or Neil, do you have anything? Greg, I'm not sure who's going to start on. Beautiful, thanks. All right. And if I missed anything by way of introduction, say. Feel free.
Well, first of all, thank you all for coming out, taking time out of your day on what is a stunning day. It's always delightful for us to come out here, always especially delightful when you deliver weather as beautiful as this. I also want to thank all the folks who are watching online. Community engagement around these issues is the essential factor in achieving what the town wants to achieve. All the best lawyers in the world and all the best elected representatives in the world are only as strong as the voices of the community behind them. So we appreciate you paying attention to this issue as it evolves, and we welcome you to reach out to us directly at any time, including in the Q&A session, but certainly after that. If you have any questions about this process as it goes forward, our direct contact information will be made available, and we would welcome you to reach out to us. We have an agenda that includes us talking a little bit and then hopefully us having a conversation. And then we'll do a little bit more introduction of our firm and what our job is on your behalf. The agenda, Claire, did you have? Okay, moving to the next slide. I'll be better at calling that out. Thank you. The agenda includes 6 topics. And if you feel like there's something that's not addressed here, feel free to tell us and we will get to it. The first is, want to give you kind of a 30,000-foot overview of offshore wind development in the East in the United States. The second is we'll look very specifically at the projects that the federal government has acknowledged will have impacts on Block Island. The third is a brief primer on what U.S. federal law requires of BOEM, of the developers. The third or fourth will be what is it that the town has been doing for the past couple of years? What is it going to be doing going forward? And what is it that the town wants? The fifth will be our observation about the current crux of the matter, which is an imbalance between the potential harms to Block Island and the mitigation that is being proposed for those harms. And then finally, we'll open it up to Q&A. Does that sound good to everybody? Okay, next slide, please. Our client, your town, has asked us to make it clear that the conversation we're having today is not anti-clean energy. The town is pro-renewable energy, but with 2 conditions. It should be developed legally, consistently with the requirements of federal law, and we'll go into that in a little bit more detail. And any harms that are done in the development of that project should be accurately mapped, considered, and mitigated to the extent possible. Next slide, please. Just briefly about our firm, so you know what angle we're coming at this with. We think still, after 13 years, the only firm in the world that just does the nerdy type of law called cultural heritage law. And that has a huge range of things. We've got an art law practice where we get, Nazi looted art back to its heirs, and we do a whole bunch of stuff with American Indian tribes. But we frequently represent historic communities that are attempting to evaluate what the impacts of development projects are on their historic and cultural resources. Not just always direct impacts, like we're going to build a road and that requires us to tear down a historic building, but also indirect impacts, noise, interference with traditional views, those types of things. And our firm is not, I would say, extreme on one side or the other. The only clients that we take on are clients that understand that in the real world, we have to strike a balance between environmental and cultural preservation and development. But we believe that balance is achievable. And when we believe that when folks tell you you can only have one or the other, you're either pro-preservation or pro-wind, you have to make a choice, there's a zero-sum game. We believe that's a false choice that is offered to communities. I've been practicing law for 23 years, 13 years under the banner of our own firm focused on this. My colleague, Will Cook, to the right of me, may have been practicing even a couple more years than that. I haven't done the count. But before Will joined our firm, he spent many years as a lawyer for the National Trust for Historic Preservation. And in that context was exposed to the first wind farm proposed development in New England, which was many years ago, which ultimately fell under its own weight. So Will has been paying attention to issues around wind farms for as long as they've been contemplated in modern times. And then Claire has joined us in recent years to keep Will and I from wandering off. into the wilderness when we get confused by the 1,000 names that are given to the wind farms out there. Claire keeps us on track, and they change the names on a regular basis. I don't know if you've noticed that, but some of the farms that are off the coast have been through 2 or 3 different names, which makes it tough, not just for the lawyers to track, but it makes it tough for the public to understand what's going on, where you've been paying attention to something that's been named A for 6 months, 2 years, and then it suddenly has a different name. Next slide, please. Yes, sir.
Would you coach the audience about the sensitivity of the microphone?
Yes.
So basically, these are very directional. So talk into the mic if you can, or slide it over. That would be much better.
Absolutely. How's that?
Literally at an angle that doesn't pick it up.
I appreciate that.
Because I'll get a lot of texts about it, so.
Will you really? Well, for those who have been listening so far, for those who have been listening so far, my apologies for forgetting the instructions about the mic, and I will attempt to speak directly thereafter. 30,000-foot view, thank you, is that wind farms are being developed off the East Coast at generally a faster rate than any other industrialization effort that we've seen in recent decades. There's a political and a social reason for that, of course, which is that we have global warming and climate change. And the political reason is that the President of the United States has identified permitting of offshore wind as his top priority in terms of addressing climate change. Off the East Coast alone, there are 21 farms currently, I wouldn't say on the dashboard. There's technically a federal dashboard that you can go to and see them tracked, but that we're aware of at this point, that are far enough along in conception and development. That does not mean that there will only be 21 farms off the coast. There are still lease areas that were approved a dozen or so years ago, for which the competition to fill those with turbines is still in the future. Our best guess, and I say, unfortunately, it's a guess because permitting is going so quickly that there are very fundamental questions that the public might have, like how many turbines are going to be off the coast, that are very difficult to answer based on the information that BOEM, the federal agency that's charged with regulating this development on behalf of the American public, and the developers themselves are not putting out to the public. But our best guess is between 2,000 and 4,000 turbines. The height of those turbines will be roughly 850 feet to 1,200 feet. Frequently, the way this works is that a developer will say in its plans, we're going to use an 850-foot turbine, but then if you read the small print, it says we have the option to increase it as technology evolves. So by the time some of these farms are built, you will certainly have turbines that are 3+ times the height of the Statue of Liberty or the Eiffel Tower. Choose your cultural reference, but these are extremely tall. They're so tall, in fact, that there are a handful of ships in the world that are capable of carrying them, which is one obstacle that some of the wind farms are facing, is that they're producing it so quickly, it's faster than they can get their hands on the ships.
I think, Greg, just for perspective, I believe that the Block Island wind farm turbines are about 593 feet tall.
So more than 2.5 times is what you would expect to see. The thing that shocks most people when we do these talks is that the vast majority of these turbines will be visible from shore. The rough science on this is that on a clear day, if you're standing on a beach, you can see between 35 and 40 miles from shore. If you're in one of the lighthouses here on the island, you could probably easily see up to 45 miles. As you'll see with a map that we're going to show you in a little bit, that captures a lot of turbines. And one thing I wanted to put up here is we hear a lot about in this dialogue about how if you kind of question the design or the scale of offshore wind, that you're really questioning the value of mitigation measures for climate change. And here, to use BOEM's own observations from its own reports, BOEM has said, look, these things are important in the sense that they are a part of what will have to be a much, much larger strategy to have any discernible impact on global warming. And that if you take all the turbines that they have planned currently between 2,000 and 4,000 on the East Coast, and you attempt to measure the positive impact of those turbines generating energy on global warming reduction, it is too small to measure. It is either negligible or minor, in BOEM's own words. That is not us saying they shouldn't be built, that they're not important, but it is putting into perspective the fact that the world and the United States are going to have to advance a lot of strategies to be able to address global warming, and that the messaging that these are the only strategies that are available, take it or leave it, is kind of inconsistent with what BOEM itself is observing. Next slide, please. So larger context here is that Rhode Island has made a commitment to attempt to achieve 100% renewable energy by 2030. I'm going to scroll down so I can keep speaking into the microphone. And of course, the Block Island Wind Farm, the 5 that you have off of your coast, was the first in the United States. We were legal counsel to 2 of your nonprofits on the island in the final negotiations over that wind farm. And I'm happy to answer additional questions about that. We'll have a reference to it later, but we've been here thinking about offshore wind off of Block Island for many years now. Block Island will go if the 3 next farms that are planned, and the 2 of which are basically approved, the 3rd of which will be approved soon. If those go forward, you will go from 5 turbines off your coast to at least 176 turbines off your coast. Now, if the subsequent 2 farms, there's 2 more beyond those 3, are also approved, then you will be up to either 599 or 600 visible turbines off your coast. Next slide. So that is your current view. The companies and BOEM have not issued a simulation of what it would look like from this particular perspective. They have offered some visual simulations, which we will share with you shortly. Next slide, please. So here are the 3 near-term farms: South Fork, Revolution, and Sunrise. I note that even as late as either this morning or last night, I can't remember, the time is flying now, there was an article talking about how Ørsted's wavering a little bit on Sunrise because they so misjudged the costs of what it was going to take to build that they went back to the state and asked, can you renegotiate the contract and pay us, pay us more? The response was no. And so let's put a slight question mark around that. There's so much energy and time that's gone into getting this down the permitting road that I would be surprised if they didn't find a way to proceed. But these 3 are South Fork. You'll notice something about the numbers: 12 turbines first, then 65 and 94. I am not a conspiracy theorist, but I will tell you that I think it's quite obvious that the reason that they're putting 12 turbines out first is to establish a precedent that is not favorable to the island while people are mostly asleep because it's just 12 turbines. And then once that pattern, that regulatory pattern is established, you get the big numbers after that. These numbers of turbines and their heights come from the company itself. But the 100% visibility factor comes in part from the company, but also from an independent scientist that we have hired who's an expert in visual simulations. So we did not take the company's word for it. We went out and hired a smart and expensive professor whose job all day long is to figure out the science. And generally speaking, is in a map that will show you if you're looking from a certain angle out at the ocean, 100% of your view is going to be occupied by turbines. Next slide, please. So this is a map produced by our expert. And what you see is if you're standing where the little black dot is there on Block Island, and you're looking with normal eyes, which don't see, of course, 180 degrees, but the typical range of view, and you're looking out to where the farms are going to be built. That red line that you see is roughly the point at which, if you're standing on a beach, you're going to see turbines. That's your 176 turbines. If you're up in one of the lighthouses, you get an extra 10 miles of range, and that jacks it up to close to 600 turbines. Now, these are as exact as we can get them. You may find that the minimum that new ones you're going to see is probably 170 some. It may actually be more than that from the beach. And then, of course, as you get far out into the ocean, the curvature of the Earth, the natural curvature of the Earth makes it impossible to see even the tallest turbines once you get beyond about 45 miles. We could talk all day about, is it necessary to build them this close to shore? There are some that are coming in off of Cape May County, for instance, that are only 8 miles out, and that's in the hundreds. You can imagine the ones that you've got that are 3 miles off, and those are quite visible. Happy to answer questions about that later, but it's generally a factor of the continental shelf and cost. The closer you build them to shore, the less money it costs the company. Next slide, please. So what does federal law require? There are 2 laws that we deal with every day and that are most relevant to you. The first is the National Historic Preservation Act, passed by Lyndon Johnson 50 plus years ago. And the second is the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA. So NHPA and NEPA. Even though the National Environmental Policy Act sounds like it's all about the environment, it actually has some very strong provisions also protecting cultural and historic resources. So those 2 laws in combination are the ones that we deal with every day. And so think about historic resources as divided into 2 categories. Those resources that are listed or eligible for listing on the National Register of Historic Places, and those resources that are National Historic Landmarks, like the Southeast Lighthouse. If you have the first of those, and you have lots of the first of those, then what's required of, technically it's required of BOEM, or it's required of whatever federal agency. So if you're putting in a highway, it's required of the Department of Transportation. If you're working around a military base, it's the Department of Defense. Those agencies are charged to be your and the public's representative to the developer, looking out for your interests. What happens if you're in a supercharged political environment and a lot of pressure coming from Washington and the state houses saying, build these really quickly, and you have a federal bureaucracy that doesn't have enough people? Like BOEM had 1 person for the early years to monitor all those 21 projects. What happens is you start to skip steps. and Boehm ends up more of a greasing the skids for kind of what the corporation says that it wants than it does necessarily advocating for the public's broad interest. But what the law requires is that first, so two categories. If you got the general historic stuff, which you guys have a lot of, you're required to attempt to avoid and minimize the harms. Those could be physical harms, those could be visual harms, audio harms. And then if you have National Historic Landmarks, it's a heightened standard, which is you should exert every possible means to eliminate those harms. And then finally, once you accurately map what the harms are, you're then supposed to say, well, what can we do to offset those harms? Sometimes what you do is you redesign a project. You can move the closest turbine rows farther away from shore. You can reduce the height. You can adopt different paint colors. You can adopt a lighting system that reduces nighttime lighting. Whole bunch of stuff that you can do that does not involve any money in terms of a direct financial transfer. And then the second thing that you can do is you can say, okay, even if we make those changes, there are still going to be harms. What do we do then? And then that's when you talk about things like, well, is the company going to help the community have the resources to invest in measures that countervail the impacts? So let's go to the next slide. Thank you. So, what are adverse effects? There are lots of them we're summarizing here, but by and large, they are, in this case, significant visual impacts on a visual landscape that Block Island relies on heavily for its heritage tourism economy. Okay. In some cases, when the power lines are being brought on shore, you also have physical impacts. But in this case, it's visible impacts, and it's over 30 years, which is the kind of minimum projected lifespan of these turbines. And then there's economic loss in tourism revenues. Think about how much of your economy, from the waitress who serves the sandwiches at the local restaurant, to the folks that own the historic hotels, to the people who have visited here for 25 years over Thanksgiving because that's what their family does. And then imagine that there is some percentage of them that are not coming back. You do the math over 30 years, it becomes potentially a significant number. And the community has the right to think about how are we going to offset those potential losses going forward. Next slide. You all have this in your packet. Technically, the scientists say that if you want to give your eyes the most accurate representation of how they will perceive these wind turbines, you should basically print these simulations in this size and hold them, 12 inches? 1 foot from your face. And that's a way, not being out there and not having the turbines, to most accurately represent what you're going to see. So you'll see that at sunrise, your entire view will essentially be industrialized. And I say that not in a pejorative way, again, not anti-wind, but just as a reflection of the fact that you will see machinery. We do cases sometimes that involve mining, right? Or fracking or pipelines. A lot of people will find these much prettier than they find a strip mine, right? But not everybody. And so that's when we have to ask the question on behalf of the community, what percentage of folks will not want to look at this for 30 years? And what does that mean in terms of potential harms to your tourism economy? And what are we going to do about that?
So remind me on the visual, is this encompassing all of them or the most closest one? Because if it's only one, then obviously it gets progressively worse as they build. It is cumulative, great.
Cumulative of the three that we now know. So there will be two behind this with approximately 3 times as many turbines as you see will be behind this and visible, but obviously they'll be smaller than what you see here. Good question. Thank you.
Can I ask one more?
Yes.
You mentioned 15 to 30% of economic loss. Where's that data from? Because that seems different than what we've experienced in the last 10 years.
Yes, and I did not mention those specific numbers, although I had them in my notes here, and you saw. Did I say 15 to 30? Did I say it out loud? No. There are what any fair-minded person would say are an inadequate number of studies done on the impacts of offshore wind. Even if you look at Europe and say, well, Americans are like Europeans, which is, of course, a huge assumption. The studies over there are not adequate. We're moving so quickly here in the United States to build these out that the types of studies that you would see in Europe about what do people feel about these things at a certain distance from shore, at a certain height, at a certain number, that's largely not available in the United States. And it won't be in time for you having to make decisions about whether or not you're excited about this or not. It simply won't be. That is also true for impacts on fisheries. Those studies are BOEM's like, we don't have time. However, there are 2 studies that have been done that I think are revealing that give us, at least your lawyers, a basic framework for the danger zone. The first study is that Ørsted, the major developer in this area, and really probably the largest in the United States, which is a Danish-owned company. Ørsted apparently did its own internal evaluation of impacts on heritage tourism of an East Coast town with these turbines off the coast. They did not make that study public. Their marketing department accidentally disclosed that they had done this study because they were bragging that at least 85% of the people will come back. What they tacitly acknowledged is that 15% of the people, according to their own study, will not come back. And so we've been using as now Ørsted's official position in its filings with BOEM is that not only will 15% of tourists not be put off by this, but maybe there will be thousands more tourists who will come who wouldn't have come previously because they want this view. To give credit where credit is due, there will be some marginal increase of people who come up and say, I want to take a $25 boat tour out to see these turbines. That's absolutely true. It's demonstrated here. It's demonstrated in Europe. But that number is minuscule compared to 15% of your regular public not coming back. So the upper side of that number, the 30%, comes from a study that Cape May County itself commissioned, and it asked all of its annual tourists and its regular folks, how many of you will come back if you see this offshore? And their response in a extensive study was 30%. People won't come back. So, folks can do with that what they will. And we could talk about that a little bit more.
One interesting thing to note is there are non-wind related studies that have been done in communities like Charleston, South Carolina, for example, and other historic communities like your own. And what they found is that with heritage tourists, people who come to historic communities like this, once the brand gets damaged, they are less likely to come back than, say, someone who might visit a place like Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. So there's a lot of anecdotal evidence that people who value historic communities for a place to visit care a lot more. And they also tend to react more strongly than other visitors when let's just say the brand is damaged or when a view shed is interrupted.
Great point. There was one other element of your comment, Sven, that I didn't get to, which was, 15 to 30% isn't necessarily consistent with what you've been seeing with the 5 turbines off the coast. And I think the only point we would make is that vast difference between 5 charming turbines off the coast and 500. And so it's important for us to acknowledge, I think, which is not any of our fault, the limitations of the time and energy that's put into studies, and really not take the industry's word for it, because they're going to build their turbines, they're going to be making their profits, they're going to say they're neighbors for 30 years, but they're going to be back in the Netherlands. You all will be here having to deal with the situation on the ground, which is what we're trying to figure out. Next slide. So the primary developer for the farms off of your coast, at least these next 3, is Ørsted. They are owned by the Danish government. You hit the next slide. Yeah, thank you. What's that?
It's a stock, it's a general stock of the government. Right now. It's not on the
Okay. I'll take your word for it, but generally it's acknowledged publicly that the company is controlled and owned in majority share by the Danish government. And so I'm happy to see what you're seeing afterwards and compare notes. And certainly if I'm wrong, we'll correct the record. But generally speaking, it's understood to be Danish government controlled. And to give context, a couple of years ago, when the 5 farms were built, of the 5 turbines were built off of Block Island, the companies that were operating here in the US were small, nascent. What we're dealing with now are companies that are some of the largest corporations in the world. In terms of Ørsted, they, notwithstanding their requests to be paid more because they misjudged how much some of these projects were going to be cost. In recent years, they've made billions off of offshore wind alone. Their earnings in recent years have been at least 2 times the gross domestic product of the entirety of your state. And they have 7 of the largest proposed farms off the coast of the United States active at this time. They did not originally develop your Block Island wind farm, but they purchased the company that did develop it. So Ørsted now owns that as well. Next slide, please. So in summary, briefly, what is the town doing and what have we been doing with ourselves for the past couple of years? First is that we requested on the town's behalf that BOEM consider you a consulting party. So generally speaking, if you don't ask for that, they'll treat you as a member of the public and you're entitled to some things. But if you're a consulting party, what they're acknowledging is that you are going to be significantly at some point impacted by this project, and you should have a voice in the process. Pardon me. And then thereafter, for the past 3 years, God bless Will and Claire, because they've done more of these than I have. BOEM has had many meetings with consulting parties in which they ask you to show up, express your concerns. BOEM is not obligated to respond at all to your concerns in those meetings. They're just listening sessions, and they're not obligated to tell you what they did with those concerns afterwards. So the process leaves communities and consulting parties somewhat blind, but we've done lots of those. And then the fun part is we submit excruciatingly detailed, sometimes infinitely long, formal comments on the public record on BOEM's docket, expressing concerns, questions, identifying areas where BOEM could provide better information to the public. And we have been doing that, and all that information has been public. And now you can certainly find that on a dedicated page that Block Island has set up. So anything that we've ever said formally on behalf of Block Island over the past 3 years to the federal government is public and available. I apologize in advance that some of it is a little bit lawyerly. We try and keep it as plain English as possible, but it's all there for you to see and take a look at and follow up with any questions that you might have. And then the final thing we've done is we have said to the developer, look, your interest is in building these turbines. BOEM is, in our opinion, shortchanging the process and not acknowledging the rights of consulting parties, including Block Island. Are you going to kind of stand behind BOEM, or will you come out from behind BOEM and talk directly with the community? And so we have offered that. And without saying too much, I would just say that that invitation remains outstanding. So far, as we'll see in the next slide, or maybe it's the second to next slide. Yes, it's the slide after this. This is what we have requested in writing in these consulting meetings by smoke signal, every possible way that we could attempt to communicate with the government and with Ørsted. First always is design changes. Is there anything that we can do to not have as many of these be visible? Now, to be clear, the lease areas that were set out for these were set, negotiated, and approved by the federal government a dozen or more years ago, right? We weren't here, y'all weren't here. Most communities didn't know what was going on. And so the legal fight over whether or not you could move these lease areas way out into the ocean is technically over. We can't, as your lawyers, sue the federal government directly and say, we want to change the lease area, because that decision was made years ago when most people weren't paying attention and had no idea what it meant, for better or worse. But the first thing we ask is design changes. Now, Ørsted is adopting some design changes that are now standard for the industry. After Vineyard Wind off of Nantucket was negotiated, that company agreed to do certain things that companies prior to that had not agreed to do. They agreed to adopt a new painting system that had less reflective colors, adopt a lighting system where at night, as the planes come in, they go off and that they're not on the full time, so you don't have them blinking as much as you do. Vineyard Wind agreed to move some of the closest turbine rows back because they had that flexibility. A lot of that stuff, the design stuff, is now standard. So Ørsted is saying we're doing these things and wanting credit for it, but everybody's doing it now, so it's not particularly special. Let's move to. Let's see. So the second
Can I
thing.
just ask a
Yeah.
question? Because you said technically
Mhm.
about what was done without people in the know. So it can't be adjudicated or sued or whatever, because you use technically. So I just want to make sure I understand what that word meant.
Yes, you're asking a great question. Anybody can sue for anything, but if you have ethical lawyers, they can't sue unless they believe they have a legitimate claim. And the time to have sued for the design of the lease areas was a decade ago. Does that make it will?
Yeah.
Just also to let everyone know, it's also our understanding that at that time when these lease areas were being drawn in the ocean, there was also a misunderstanding by many local governments and preservation advocacy groups that the turbines would not be visible. And so they're just wasn't opposition to that because people, as we understand it, didn't believe that they would be seen.
Right. If they're not seen, you have no tangible legal impact. You have no recourse, really. But from what we've heard from the folks who were around back then, the impression everybody was under was, you're not going to see these things. Don't worry about it. And, you know, frankly, some of the current developers are still saying, oh, you'll have mostly cloudy days. You won't see these things. But if you go up to Nantucket right now and ask those folks what they see as, as Vineyard Wind is being built out, that's a perspective. Yes, ma'am.
Hey, Renee, you gotta come up. This one works too, whichever is more convenient. Just make sure the green light is on as usual.
Right, or
Really?
really great. So I was just gonna ask about that Nantucket turbine. I understand the first one has been erected, but from where it is on the map, according to the distances you're giving us, we should be able to see that from here. Is that correct? Because I looked the
don't-
other day and saw nothing.
Yeah, I don't think we've done that math, frankly, but we can.
No, it's outside of the 45 miles.
Yeah.
Oh, I see. It's beyond 45 miles. So
Yeah. If you look at this map, it's the blue one farthest east.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am. The second thing is, even if Ørsted said, you know what, we can move some of these turbines, we can shift them around, we can do all these things, because of where the lease areas are sited, you are still going to have significant visual impacts for 30 years if these are built. Now, there may be other reasons that these farms are not built, right? Some of them are not being built because the cost of steel is going up, and some of the companies aren't as big as Ørsted and can't withstand some of the fluctuations in the market. People are waking up to the actual visual impacts. There may be reasons that they're not built, but if they are built, you're still going to have visual impacts. What we do then is we say it is not fair for BOEM to allow a developer to get away with saying, let's put all the risk on the community alone. Everybody, when you're addressing climate change, has to take some risk, right? Everybody's got some skin in the game. Everybody's got to make sacrifices. But federal law does not allow the developer to say, we take all the profits, you guys have all the risks. So what happens then is the developer typically says, you know what, we will invest in some things in the community that the community can use to offset the impacts. Now, let's imagine that's in the context of heritage tourism. If you've got 15% of your heritage tourists who are saying, we're not coming back to look at this landscape, can you replace them with other tourists? Sure, but not without significant resources, right? And so what happens is and has happened here, is happening up and down the East Coast, because BOEM is moving so quickly. The developers' consultants are largely saying, we don't know what these communities want or need, but how about we offer them, like, we'll do a $50,000 report talking about how historic their community is. Or we'll take the historic register nomination that listed a lot of your resources as already eligible for listing on the national.
From the Block Island project.
Yeah, from the Block Island project. They'll say, hey, let's duplicate the work that was already done for the Block Island project. It's largely because they haven't been to your island. I mean, the consultants haven't been out. And to the extent that we're describing things that the island could actually use, they're not yet paying attention. And so the model that has worked in Europe, that we have seen adapted in two places, we've largely seen it adapted in the Vineyard Wind model in the US, which is the first at scale offshore wind. which is where the municipality says, look, the impacts of these are largely going to be unknown until they show up over 30 years. It is unfair for you to ask us to identify a handful of projects on day one and then not have resources for the next 29 years to respond to what actually happens. And no one knows what's going to happen because these things haven't been built before. The studies haven't been done, but even if the studies had been done, those studies are just crystal balls, right? So a community benefit fund basically says, okay, you developer, put enough resources into this fund that over 30 years, the community, its nonprofits, its civil society, the public can decide how to use those funds to invest in countervailing measures to give you the best chance of that 15% or that 30% not showing up or showing up in a different, more manageable way that doesn't harm you. That's the basic concept. Unfortunately, to date, Orsted and Boehm have largely pushed back, said, the wind is at our back, the political winds are. We're not afraid of you yet. And we're just going to push forward. And because everybody's pushing forward on so many different fronts, their assumption is that communities like Block Island or Nantucket or others will, when push comes to shove, just say, we can't fight the big boys. Let's just let it go and take what we get. Now, I will draw a parallel between where we are now and where things were when the first Block Island wind farm was built and when Vineyard Wind was built. At both of those stages that are commensurate with this stage, you and Nantucket were getting treated in exactly the same way you're getting treated now, which is the regulatory agency, but most importantly, the developer, which really has the ability to change the situation. They don't pay attention until they have to. And when do they have to pay attention? When it's the last minute, they're looking to get their permit, they're looking to move forward, and someone says, hey, you haven't been paying attention to us. So that's the leverage that communities have. And it's the question for the community is, do you exercise it or do you take what they're offering? And I want to describe to you what it is they're offering in a little bit more detail, so this isn't so theoretical. Next slide, please. So unlike the Block Island wind farm, which small as it was, had some positive impacts. There was power generated by that comes to your community, as I understand it. There was a internet line that was run commensurate, which helped solve some of the connectivity issues. And for those two nonprofits that we represented, initially the offer from the company was, something like, here's $30,000 or $40,000 to invest in the lighthouse for the next 30 years. That went up to $2.5 million in in mitigation. And what is being proposed now involves no direct power from these farms coming to Block Island. There is no additional bennies that are coming in terms of internet line. If there is direct power coming, I'll love to hear about it and amend my remarks. And then thirdly, the total amount that the company has put on the table so far for all three farms, which would be, close to 170 turbines, is 2.5 million in mitigation. So the island, not the government, but two nonprofits on the island got 2.5 million for 5 turbines. They're offering you 2.5 million for 179 more turbines. We could, if you want to at some point, break down what that 2.5 million is, but I kind of summarized it previously. These are not projects that the town wants, or they're projects that the town already has done, or they're things that really are from the experts on the town and from our opinion, having done this, not meaningfully advancing the ball in terms of protecting any of your historic resources. They would keep the consultants to the developer busy. A lot of these projects are, hey, pay our consultant the money. We give it to you, you pay it back to our consultant, we'll come out and do a report. And even that 2.5 million, unlike the previous 2.5 million, is not guaranteed. They're suggesting that it be put in a competitive pool and you compete for this money against one another. And even then it's not guaranteed. The final point up there is that if you're proposing mitigation, as some of that 2.5 million does, for historic properties that are owned privately, you're supposed to talk to the owner before you put in writing, this is what we want to do. The owners haven't been spoken to. It's been 2.5, 3 years, and they have a proposed memorandum of agreement that says we're going to give this property $30,000. That property owner's never heard from Boehm. We could go on, but there's probably a dozen of what we would consider legal errors as the process is being rushed. And the question of what to do about that is up. I think we're on our last or second.
Would you go ahead and share at the last meeting you shared just to give context where the Nantucket offer came in originally and what they ended up with, just to give people.
Yes. In Nantucket for Vineyard, let me preface this by saying y'all are familiar with wetlands mitigation, right? That's gone on so regularly in the United States that there's now a formula. Certain amount of wetlands impacted. If a company wants to offset that, they can buy carbon or they can put money into a pool. That isn't the case for visual impacts on historic resources in the United States. It hasn't, there are major cases, of course, that we rely on that are favorable to arguing that these resources are valuable, but there's no pattern. So there's nothing that says if you have 179 turbines and they're 1,000 feet tall and they're 15 miles off your coast and your economy makes X amount of dollars, the company should contribute the following. It doesn't exist. So what exists is what the communities are willing to draw a line on and say, this is what we think is reasonable and what they're willing to settle for. In Nantucket for Vineyard Wind, the original offer from the company was, I think, $800,000 for 30 years of impacts. What was originally settled was for $34 million, so 800,000 up to 34 million. And then the municipality just said, hey, instead of 34 million over 30 years, we'd rather have it over 8 to 10 years. And when you take net present value of the money earlier, it comes down to something like 16 million. So is 16 million a lot of money for a place like Nantucket? You know, people can be the judge. Because it's the first and it's also the largest such settlements for visual impacts in the United States. It's a precedent for what it is. But even your more direct precedent shows you that there's a massive amount of resources that the companies have available, and that will go to the squeaky wheel. That's the bottom line. Did I answer the question? Did I? I probably answered that in 5 more questions because that's what we do. So what can you do? I believe this is our final slide before Q&A, formal Q&A. Speak up. Even if you don't say, oh, you know, the town should ask for this or that or those specifics, simply saying that Boehm and the developers should comply with federal law and telling that to people whose job it is to make sure that they follow the law is great help. A phone call, an email, letter to the editor. You want to know what that should look like, you can reach out to us and we'd be happy to be of assistance. And so that covers 1 and 2. And then thirdly, just please ask your family and your neighbors to pay closer attention as we go forward. The worst scenario would be for folks to have buyer's remorse or to get to the point where they're like, hey, we didn't know what was going on. This went so quickly. We've lived here for 4 generations. The unobscured view of the ocean is what defines the character of our community, and that is now gone for us and our grandkids for the foreseeable future. All they're going to see is turbines, and then say, we didn't know what was going on. So part of the reason we're coming to the island, part of the reason that we do these information sessions is to make sure that at this critical time, as the window to say something about these 3 projects in particular is closing, that you have the information that we have. And then of course that your elected representatives have to be able to make a decision about what you want to do. Do my colleagues have anything more to say before we open it up? No. Okay.
Would you just state the deadline?
There are multiple deadlines, but South Fork is technically approved. And while there is not, well, let me turn it over to my more qualified colleagues to keep myself out of trouble.
No, so the way that these projects have been permitted is the timelines are staggered. The first of these projects to secure approval from BOEM was the South Fork project. The time that one would have to challenge the National Environmental Policy Act review failures, I believe that deadlines, there's a special federal statute of limitations is around November 23rd of 2023. The Section 106 challenges are unclear. There's no statute of limitations about them under federal law. The federal courts look at a special equitable doctrine. I hate throwing these legal words out to you, but it's called laches, L-A-C-H-E-S. And the courts have never exactly defined how long that is. But generally speaking, you try to sue or appeal agency decisions in cases like this as close in time to the time that the permits have been secured. But right on the heels of South Fork, Revolution has just been approved. And then if Sunrise goes forward, Sunrise is going to be approved in early December of 2023. So as Greg was talking earlier, there's a huge rush under federal law to get these projects up and running. And that timeline is about 2 years or less for each one. And a lot of them, these timelines are running concurrently.
So soon. And I want to emphasize what a distinction Will just said, which is these are kind of bureaucratic appeals. BOEM has issued a record of decision. When you appeal it, what you're asking a court to do is not hold like a traditional trial that you see on television where you call in, new witnesses, take new evidence. All the court can look at is the administrative record. That's everything that BOEM has made public, everything the developer has made public, and everything that we have filed on your behalf. That's roughly the 4 corners of what they can look at. And what we would be doing in this and other circumstances up and down the East Coast is saying, Your Honor, not anti-wind, not trying to stop these, asking the court to make sure that the agency and the developer follow the law. Here are the 10 ways they're not following the law. And, Your Honor, if we allow the law to be broken because we're pro-wind, then those same laws will be easy to break when fracking comes up or mining comes up or whatever. You weaken the laws for the stuff that you find tolerable, those laws remain weak for the stuff that is an even more serious threat. So that's the kind of theory behind it. Additional questions, and we'll make our answers to subsequent.
Well, just to add that a victory on an appeal is not stopping the project. That's not how our federal environmental and preservation laws work. As Greg mentioned, Congress designed them to balance economic development or development with preservation, conservation. So if on appeal, a federal court agrees that a federal agency made legal errors and skipped steps, the remedy is to send the matter back to the federal agency to permit the project correctly as the law requires.
Other questions?
Questions from the audience or
Sir.
comments or? Hey, Mark.
Hi, just a clarification and a question. The visual simulation you have says sunrise wind, but you're saying it's all 4 of the ones within the 45?
Yeah, so a lot of the visualizations, they have to do a cumulative visualization. So that shows, we chose sunrise because it had the best visuals we thought, but it includes Revolution and South Fork.
Okay.
Yes.
And I take it from your presentation that that you think the island could have negotiated a better deal with the original 5. Is that your view at the?
No, well, one, it'd be totally inappropriate for me to express an opinion about what the island should or shouldn't have done. We were not the island's counsel, and I don't ever like to second guess when I wasn't at the table. So no, if it came off as we were making any judgment about what happened, then that's not correct. The only thing I was expressing some confidence in is that the things that we negotiated on behalf of those 2 nonprofits were substantial increases. And the only reason they were increases is because those nonprofits said this is not adequate.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions? No.
Sir.
Was coming from. So this is one. Yes. Guilty again. Thank you. This is a comment, not a question, but you can respond and ask me a question if you like.
Okay.
So back on page 11, you were discussing adverse effects. And you talk about the 15% tourist impact loss of the despoiled view shed, particularly with respect to the despoiled view sheds in sense of place. So what you didn't say, but I would like you to add it to your portfolio if it isn't already in your mental portfolio, is the importance of the sense of place to the non-tourist population, which is the year-round population for whom this is home. This is not a place to visit. This is home. And I would extend that to the significant summer residential population who in many respects are not tourists. There's important contributors to the year-round community, not only in terms of real estate taxes that they pay, but they're working members on committees and all the different volunteer organizations that contribute to the sense of place, whether they are physically living here and only living here. So in that context, it's important to realize that. Let me first confess that I was one of those that 15 years ago was naive enough to think that if they were over the horizon, which is on the banner page of Deepwater Wind's original website, that was the first thing they said. Nobody wants to look at these. And in the future, they'll be over the horizon. Well, guess what? I was wrong. And the practical reality is 10 days ago, I found my first one that I was speaking with Keith about before the meeting convened. It's far enough away that I could only find it because it was pointed out to me from somebody who saw it coming up with the rising sun behind it. It's this monopole that comes about 30 to 40 feet out of the water, and it's bright yellow. So the color is not significant other than in terms of one's ability to see it when it's only 40 feet above the horizon, I should say, not necessarily out of the water. So who knows how tall it really is, but it's one of the beginning foundations. The point being, now that I've seen it with my binoculars, now I can see it with my naked eye too, because I know exactly where to look. You put 600 out, or even 200 of those out there, and it's going to have an impact on my personal sense of place. And I would suggest that on the scale in which our concern in today's discussion is being placed, it would affect just about every year-round and summer residential member of this community's sense of place. And that is true cultural harm. Thank you.
Thank you, David. If there aren't any more questions.
I just wanted to say, if I may, that at the end of the Q&A, I had asked Claire about the night sky impacts, and you've already talked a little bit about the lighting, which is being suggested could be part of the current designs, is on off. But you had a simulation of what the night sky impact might be, and I think this group would be interested in seeing that before the day's over. Thank you.
Yes, we're about to start that. Henry, you can go first. We'll start the public comment portion. Do you want to start that?
Sure. Thank you.
Thank you, Henry.
Hi, I'm Henry DuPont. And quick question. How are you gentlemen, lady, paid for your services? Is it through retainer and hourly work, or is it a percentage of the funds that you get for the town?
We are on because municipalities don't have the money to pay lawyers for 3 years of work, generally speaking. We're on a contingent basis, which means that unless the town recovers both design changes and some form of remediation for the harms that stay after mitigation, then we have done all the work for free. So we take on the risk.
And what's your percentage of your take?
I'd have to check, but I think consistent with our agreement with the town that I'd have to get permission to share that, in part because
Well, I mean,
allow me to finish.
that's a big number if it's even 5% of what you guys are asking for, especially since I'm sure you're representing other communities.
May I finish?
Sure.
Yeah. We have no general problem on our side talking about our fees because they are consistently below market. Having said that, every piece of information we put out about our strategy or how we work is basically handing to the other side an advantage in negotiations. So it's not a matter of transparency. It's a matter of not necessarily giving a roadmap to developers or BOEM, but that's all I wanted to add.
All right, thank you.
Yeah.
So I am a wind energy project developer, consulting engineer for the last 40 years. And the first project I worked on as project manager was the DOE NASA Block Island project from 1978 to 1983, which was a 200 kilowatt wind turbine. It was put up under the Carter administration, one of our nation's very first national turbine studies. And it saved the island about 50,000 gallons of diesel fuel a year until it was taken down. So I've been involved in the actual permitting of dozens and dozens of projects. Some of them are large. Some were small municipal turbines at a water or sewer treatment plant, some onshore, some offshore. And for example, a wind turbine for the town of Dartmouth, Massachusetts at their water treatment plant, which would save them about $2 million a year. And it had some neighbors, some of them within a half mile, but most of them would be a mile or two away. And there's definite impacts to putting a large industrial wind turbine in that setting. And of course, As the project consultants, we worked hard to mitigate those. And so at the public hearings for this, first, the residents that were within a half a mile or a mile of the project would show up and they had genuine concerns. And we did everything we could to move the turbine, reduce sometimes its operating hours. There's a lot of things, as you mentioned, that you can do. But then after a little while, some other groups started showing up. And we found out that these were lawyers, law firms started showing up, and they started representing the neighbors. Some of them were up to a couple miles away, which would never even see this. And they went door to door, knocked on the door, and got these neighbors to the project fuzzed up about the impacts. And the big three that people came to the hearings about, that they're concerned about, this project would disrupt sleeping patterns, drive pets insane, and over a long period of time would actually move your house off its foundation. So we endeavored to explain with all the studies that this wouldn't happen and that this was kind of made up. And we're just amazed that every time we get to more and more hearings, these attorneys would show up with their clients, some of them that were miles away from the project site, and would make, these kinds of representations. And some of the projects they actually beat back because the town wasn't willing to do it. One of the attorneys represented in the hearing that he went to investigate another turbine, and when he rolled down his car window, I suppose it was an Audi or a Mercedes or something, that his ears popped like he was on a plane in the proximity of the turbine. Well, we all know that that doesn't happen. And at the next hearing, I was careful to drop off a package of gum on his table so that to help him with that. In any case, so this is something that's happening. Law firms are representing clients that don't even know that they want to be represented, and they are coming up with all kinds of impacts that need to be mitigated. Now, if you go to the Southeast Lighthouse and you have a pair of binoculars and someone shows you where to look, you might see some of the towers from the next turbine. But certainly, if you think you're going to be able to see them from the beach or whatnot without someone pointing them out to you, I think you'll have trouble. Yeah, some of the other impacts that these gentlemen have shown is in the literature is erosion. I'm not sure if it's from ships going out to the project site or whatever, but I think it'd be hard pressed to think that these turbines would cause us erosion. Cultural and historic, a lot of that's the eye of the beholder. Economics really important, because hundreds of studies have been done with regard to tourism and wind turbines, because in Europe, they have gigawatts of projects. And for example, the Horns Rev project was one of the first really large ones near shore off the Danish coastline. When the project was announced, and that's only a few kilometers away, people who go there for vacation and stay right on the shore in beautiful bed and breakfasts were all upset about it. And they said, we're never coming back. And sure enough, they built the wind farm, and a strange thing happened. People actually did come back, but that wasn't the same people. There were people that wanted to see what this is about, and those people were different. They actually brought their bicycles with them and rode their bikes around town instead of driving. And they asked the bed and breakfast for trash bags so that when they walked on the beach, they could pick up trash. And the whole community of visitors changed towards the environmental bent that these projects represent. And lastly, I think there's other people here that have done some research into the actual impacts of this wind farm on Block Island, and they know more about it than I do. So with regard to the industrialization of our view shed, I'll tell you, only a century ago, when something showed up on the horizon, and it was big, it was a sail, and it was coming closer. People rushed down to the dock to get the bolts of cotton cloth and to get coal for their stoves and to get stuff like that. So I mean, and those were the most advanced technological machines that we had in those days, the sailing ships from the 19th century. So if that represents the industrialization of our view shed then, and wind turbines may represent what it is now, but I'll tell you, if you're worried about climate change and sea level rise, as we all are, this is a good thing. Lastly, the representations that Ørsted is making billions of dollars and has plenty of profit to share with the communities just simply isn't true. Because of the inflation and supply chain issues, a lot of these projects are delayed and a number of them have been canceled. And Ørsted stock has, which is, you're correct, 50% of Ørsted stock is owned by the Danish government, but Ørsted stock has gone down by 40% in the last year, which represents billions of dollars of value lost to the company. And so in any case, I think that if we're all working towards mitigating climate change and sea level rise, the actual work that you're doing, which makes these projects more expensive and it makes them less likely to happen. And to say that BOEM is rushing these when everyone knows that a number of these projects have been put off for years. They thought they would get their permits years ago and they still haven't gotten them. And that's, for example, what killed Cape Wind and a number of other ones. So I just want to say that I know what you're doing and it's, I mean, it's good work for you, but it's not necessarily if you live in an area that's subject to sea level rise, it's not good for us. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Henry. Thank you. Hey, Jeff, come up. Absolutely, please.
So for the benefit of our guests, I'm Jeff Wright, the president of the Block Island Utility District.
Yes, sir.
I'm also on the National Rural Electric Cooperative Association's Board of Directors and the chair of the Business Technologies Committee. So these are issues that we deal with on a national level all the time. Before I start, I do have some written comments. Comments are addressed to the town council. It's addressed to my members. I'm representing 1,600 and roughly 50 members here. But before I start, really quick, today the sun's shining and the wind's blowing pretty good, right? In New England, 60% of our energy is coming from natural gas. Okay, 18% is coming from nuclear, 9% hydro, only 11% renewable. Of the renewables, 45% of that's wind, 25% solar, and then there's some biomass and other things in there. Without a doubt, the recent public policy at both the state and federal levels has created a renewable energy boom, which has created a rush of new projects. The new projects are becoming more and more economical every day, where they are becoming competitive with traditional resources such as nuclear, natural gas, hydro, and coal. From an environmental and energy security perspective, this is a positive move forward. At the same time these renewable projects are being built, we're aggressively shutting down fossil fuel plants at an alarming rate and in such a way that the disorderly shutdown has created a reliability concern, not just in New England, but nationwide. That's a real thing. I'm not here to debate with you, but the one exception I took is that there's no direct benefit to Block Island. The energy from these wind farms are going to feed into the ISO New England grid. We get a direct result from every kilowatt, every megawatt that's fed into the grid, without a doubt. Simply put, the retirement of reliable, always available generation plants has far outpaced the development of intermittent, non-dispatchable, not readily available generation such as wind and solar. And as a result, the nation's faced with imminent rolling blackouts, which will come with public safety and economic impacts that are just not acceptable. On November 16th, folks, I'm going to go meet with the Rhode Island PUC, the governor's office, ISO New England, and a bunch of other folks, because we're facing rolling blackouts in New England this winter. Given the correct situation, that's what we face today. We were there last Christmas Eve. We didn't
Yeah.
quite get there, but we were close. From a regional and national energy security point of view, building offshore wind makes sense as it is one of the most reliable and efficient forms of intermittent, non-dispatchable generation. From a Block Island perspective, based on our recent member survey results, 62% of our members support us, the Block Island Utility District, supporting the state's renewable energy goals, which is 100% by 2032. Okay, got pushed out a couple of years because they're a little bit more realistic. Next week, the Board of Utility Commissioners is going to vote on a power supply plan that includes Block Island meeting the Rhode Island Renewable Portfolio Standard. We're exempt. We're going to do it voluntarily because it's the right thing to do. With the help of the solar initiative, we're going to be probably one of less than 10 towns in the next year to go to 100% renewable. That's a big step for Block Island. You should be proud of that. In my mind, Block Island should support local, regional, and national renewable energy development with enthusiasm. We were, after all, the nation's poster child, right, for offshore wind. We know the impacts. We know the benefits. We reap the benefits every day. The wind farm off our shore was a life changer for every one of us. You may not know it, but I was involved with developing a wind farm in Vermont that was twice the size of the Block Island project. I've been down this road before from a developer's perspective. You've probably repeatedly heard me say, I wish I was here when the Block Island wind farm was being negotiated with the island. Let me be clear what I meant by that. I wasn't talking about funds to support affordable housing. I wasn't talking about funds to support historical societies. I was talking about economic energy contracts, renewable energy credits, and things directly related to the ratepayers on Block Island. That's it. Undergrounding power lines, the power company. There's a lot of things that the Block Island Power Company, not the town, could have done that they didn't. So when I say I wish I was here, that's simply from a power company perspective. I encourage Block Island as a community to support future offshore wind projects and discourage them from trying to make a case for a direct adverse impact that, at least in my mind, doesn't exist. The not in my backyard argument doesn't support the nation's renewable goals, which are your goals by default of democracy. You will do nothing but continue to drive the price of the projects up, which will then have an ultimate direct impact on your overall energy bills. Something somewhere has to spin in order to keep the lights on. We're a society that depends on electricity. We're a society that's addicted to electricity. Something somewhere, folks, has to spin. And right now, we're retiring assets quicker than we're building them. We're going down a dangerous path. The utility district does not support the argument that there's a direct adverse impact. And I encourage you not to be the squeaky wheel. Be a supporter.
Thank you
Thank you.
so much, Jeff. That was great. Anybody else? Barbara? Make sure that light's on, Barbara, if you don't mind.
Lights on.
Great, thank
And
you.
I'm sorry to say I'm following two tough acts for obvious reasons. Well, they were both tough in their own ways. My name is Barbara McMullen. I'm happen to be the chair of the Block Island Utility District, but I'm actually speaking as a private citizen right now. I also have a background in utility consulting and have done a lot of analysis of economic impacts. And one thing that is not clear to me from your presentation and from the documents I've looked at on the website is the jump that you make from looking at these turbines that are 15 to 20 miles away compared to the visual impacts that we have with deep water. And I'm also curious, and this is a question, you don't need to answer it now, but maybe if that information can be put on the website. Being able to see a wind turbine 45 miles away seems improbable to me. So I would like to know how that analysis was developed. I went up to the Southeast Lighthouse yesterday and I could not see the South Fork wind turbines that are being put in, much like David, until I used binoculars, and then I could see them through the binoculars, but I had to squint really hard in order to see them with the naked eye. And if I hadn't known they were there, I never would have seen them. So to infer that turbines that are 45 miles away would have the same visual, or 20 miles away would have the same visual impact as those that are 3 miles away seems like a stretch to me. And then I think when you then translate that into adverse impacts, I think, and you're extrapolating the impacts from 5 to 175 or whatever that ultimate number may be. But I think our lived experience has shown us that we did not have adverse impacts in terms of tourism, in terms of property values on the island. In fact, I think quite the reverse. I mean, there are businesses out here who actively market that we have an offshore wind farm. And so I think unless there's clear, demonstrable adverse impacts in terms of loss to this community, we should not, as a community, try to extract money from the developers, because as Jeff said way more eloquently than I'm saying, it's really important for this community, for the state, for the country, for the world to develop offshore wind, because it's one of the best alternatives we have for mitigating climate change and for providing power in a reasonable way. So I'm grateful that we're having this conversation. I think it's really important for everyone. I wish more people were here to hear it. And I hope that we have more as we go forward so we can continue to have this discussion.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara.
Is it appropriate to?
Sure, if you'd
Oh,
like.
great. So I appreciate all three of the comments that just came up. There's a lot that's in dispute. But a couple of things actually aren't, which is great to build on, right? One thing that isn't in dispute is that BOEM itself has determined that there will be significant adverse impacts. The company doesn't dispute that. We don't dispute that. That's official BOEM conclusion. That's the reason why this community has a seat at the table, is because BOEM itself, for as fast as they might want to move and as much political pressure as they're under, they have concluded that there will be significant adverse visual impacts. That's actually not one of the things that we're fighting about. The second thing is we're not fighting about how far away you can see these things. It's been industry standard that you can see them up to 40 miles, give or take, on a clear day. BOEM doesn't dispute that. Orsted doesn't dispute that. That's actually not one of the things that anybody's fighting about. The third thing, which is not true in other communities, the simulations that the developer, in other cases, Orsted has done, have been wildly off. So we've hired independent scientists to develop alternative simulations based on the data which show. Here, we haven't done that yet, but this being what you see is also not in dispute. This is the company's own simulation, not our simulation. So if you, this is what when BOEM said, produce an accurate view of what people will see on the horizon when these things are built, this is what the company produced. So if you heard me earlier to say that I'm equating 3 miles to 15 miles, I'm not. What I was saying is that going from 5 turbines to 177 turbines is a noticeable increase, and that if you are attracted to this view, you are welcome to that. And if you're not attracted to that view, you're welcome to that too. But this is not a view that we generated. This is a view that the company itself generated, which presumably is their best case scenario because they don't want to frighten people either. They have other views that actually don't comply with BOEM's own standards. You're not supposed to have clouds or cloudy days. You're supposed to simulate worst case scenario conditions so that people can see. And a lot of the other simulations that we didn't share with you are because they don't match BOEM's standard, where you're not supposed to provide visual excuses for not seeing them. So we thought this one was most accurate and compliant with BOEM's own view. I think that.
Go ahead, Barbara.
I was gonna say, it's like, I use better glasses then, because I did not see that when I was thinking out of Southeast like yesterday. Oh, because it's so low. Well, that's.
Yeah, these don't.
I know. Miles away, but they're there. And I had trouble seeing them. And the other ones are even further.
No, South Fork is not. Oh, yeah, there's no South Fork. There's no turbines up yet to look at for South Fork.
Yeah, so I don't want to debate the visual impacts, all right? But what I do want to do is I want folks in this audience, the people on YouTube and my members to understand. We all know the 3-stack unit in Providence, right? You drive into Providence and on the right-hand side, the power plant there, that's a natural gas plant, okay? On Christmas Eve, it was burning 1 million gallons a day of fuel, okay? If you don't want that, then where are you going to put 3 or 4 more of those units? Because if they retire that and they don't build this, that's what you're going to get. So again, I'm just going to say it. Something needs to spin somewhere, folks. Okay. Not everybody's going to like that. Not everybody likes ours, but I'll tell you what, ours works. Our supply is probably 6 times more power than what this island uses. So you got 2 choices, 3 stacks, power plants, or this.
One other point I wanted to make in terms of this gentleman is we've purposefully not used our own projections as to what a heritage tourism economy impact would be. We've just stuck with what Orsted itself has developed. So if it may be the case, I'm absolutely 100% sure it is the case that not everyone values historic feeling and landscape and its role in your economy equally, obviously. And so there are some people who will absolutely say, I don't care, this is beautiful, my folks are going to come back. And but clearly Orsted itself has acknowledged, if not publicly, they've now disclosed that they think that a significant amount of people won't come back. And here's the issue, ma'am, your last point, which was I thought an excellent one about not wanting to slow these down, and we don't have evidence, we don't have evidence, or the current evidence of the 5 turbines is contrary to this. By the time that evidence shows up of whether or not Orsted is right at predicting that 15% of your tourism doesn't come back and has rolling impacts, it'll be far too late for you to do anything about it. So the reason that legally you'll have zero ability to do anything. So if we're wrong and 3 or 4 years from now, these are up and running and you do see a 15% impact, you're completely out of luck legally. So you're in a window now where you can try and mitigate your own risk and say, hey, if we want to have the resources in case this does go wrong, in case Orsted is correct, now is the time to have that conversation, not afterwards, because there's no leverage afterwards. There's no legal standing once these things are approved. If you let the window to say, hey, I'm concerned, I'm not maybe 100%, maybe I'm 99% sure that there will be no heritage impact, but right now, all of that risk is on you. That's not on Orsted. There's no skin in the game for Orsted if we're wrong, if you're wrong, is my point. Sir?
David Lewis, the second time. So in my earlier comment, I was addressing the presentation. This time I'd like to talk more directly to the council. So I agree with Jeffrey Wright on just about everything he and I have ever discussed about Block Island's success with the utility district. I don't agree with everything that Jeffrey has presented today in his presentation. As it was pointed out earlier, so much of our population in this country now is being, well, this wasn't pointed out today, but there was a parallel. We're divided into single issue voters on every topic. It's hard to reach consensus on any path forward on so many things. And I would not like to see that come into play here in this discussion we're having today. As Jeffrey rightly pointed out, there's a lot of things he would have done differently had he been here for when the Block Island Wind Farm was built. Certainly, we've benefited as a community overwhelmingly from the cable. And we were lucky enough to have fiber strands in that cable as well. But let the record show that we have just finished spending $8 million to take advantage of those fiber strands to build our own internet system in our own community, which wouldn't be happened if we weren't always willing to take on costs to do things for ourselves. So now wouldn't it have been nice to have some federal largesse in terms of subsidies that are going to wind power from the federal government, which also means us as taxpayers to help us defray some of that cost? That would have been very nice, but we charged forward because we needed it. And in spite of the absence of federal or state help to build that municipal system. Similarly, with our municipal takeover of the power company, we took that on financially ourselves as a community, and we're paying off the loans for that. In the instance now with the offshore farm and the opportunity to mitigate unforeseen circumstances, first let me declare that I'm a conservationist and I'm a capitalist. You can in fact balance those two things together. And quite frankly, most of you know that I wasn't always in favor of the Block Island Wind Farm, predominantly because of the politics that it was associated with, which was so poorly slanted. And Block Island didn't come out other than with the cable from that. Everything else we paid for by ourselves with a little bit of money that came through with the easements on those first projects for bringing the cable ashore. But that's water behind the dam. The point is, we don't get, even today, we get very little help from the federal government or the state governments to run our small community as successfully as we do. At the same time, capitalism being the predominant economic engine driving this country, typically, I wouldn't be in favor of soaking the companies to pay for what the community should be able to pay for themselves. But in this instance, I think it's quite reasonable that if everyone else is doing it, we probably should get some of that benefit of some of those excess profits that Orsted as a corporation would be harvesting from these future costs. Remember that the cost of the power purchase power agreement for the Block Island Wind Farm rises to almost 49 cents a kilowatt at the end of the 20-year contract. One of the reasons that the wind farms are struggling now to meet the cost projections that they've bid on is because they perhaps have underbid those contracts so dramatically that they're a little bit worried now about having done that. Not that 49 cents a kilowatt is a good number. Heaven forbid that the state of Rhode Island would be paying that for the full 20 years somehow. But the reality is there are probably more gross excess profits there than we all realize. And I think we should not let that opportunity to go back to harvest some of that revenue when we can in fact apply that to our community for all the right reasons. Thank you.
Anybody else? Judy?
Hi, my name's Judy Gray. I live on Sands Pond Road. In the interest of full disclosure, I'm the chair of the town's Sea Level Rise Committee. However, I'm speaking to you today as a private citizen, as a more than moderately horrified retired federal employee. I'm one of the people who's lucky enough to say that I am heavily impacted by the creation of these large fields of wind turbines. And that's because of the wonderful view shed that I have from my home. I was a YIMBY, a yes in my backyard person for the Block Island Wind Farm. And in fact, I can see all 5 turbines from my house. I can honestly say that before this meeting, I thought all these turbines that were being suggested were over the horizon. I thought that, yeah, we'll see them. I can't even tell how many times I've said this to other people. Yeah, when we get a mirage, we'll be able to see them. But in a regular clear day, we shouldn't be able to. So this has been a real revelation to me. Another revelation is the fact that the developer and BOEM, clearly from your write-up anyway, are not following the law. I will absolutely write a letter in support of them having to follow the law for exactly the reasons that were laid out before. If they break it, then everybody can break it. Despite my misunderstanding of the impact of the view shed and the poor behavior of Ørsted and BOEM, which should be rectified, I have to say that when I compare having a wind farm in my backyard to all the horrible ways that fossil fuels are extracted and then the whole process of converting that into energy, I have to admit that I remain in favor of wind farm development, including these wind farms. Thank you.
Anybody else? Mark?
Mark McGuire. I'm really happy to see people focus on view shed. I think it's really important to the island, but just for the council's purpose, we have a lot of conserved land that is unmaintained and also hurts people's view shed. So I think this is something the town should be looking at separate from this issue, but I bring it up because there's been so much focus today on view shed. So I just
Thank you.
want that to be noted.
Renee, did you want to ask anything? Or comment?
I guess I should disclose that I'm the editor of the local paper.
Thank you for disclosing that.
And you're right. Why is she taking my picture? I'm wondering if there are any graphs or data, and I haven't looked all through what you brought yet, that would show the impact. And I guess it would, I'm assuming it's going to be energy output per foot of height for that tower. So that, you know, when Judy talks about thinking it's over the horizon, it probably would be if they were the same height as our turbines. But so I'm wondering if there's any data that says what the negative impact in output is the lower the height of that turbine and maybe the blades also.
Yes, there is data. I would beg y'all not to ask me to be the one to try and interpret it for you. It's incredibly complex, and the modeling that has to be done to produce visual impacts, whether it's done by the company or the expert that we've hired, is really so sophisticated that I struggle to convey its sophistication. The thickness of the turbine, the height of the turbine, the distance from shore, the number of them, and federal law kind of requires them to be spaced at least a mile apart for a variety of reasons. And then you add in the fact that these companies have promised to generate a certain amount of gigawatts. And what you have is a number of toggles that can be moved, but maybe not as many as you would think. So can companies like, say, Vineyard Wind say, yeah, we can eliminate the first couple of rows of turbines, move them back so that you don't see them? Yes. Can a company that has already had a contract in place for a couple of years to build turbines of a certain height go back and say, we want to change the height of those turbines? If you believe the energy company, they cannot. And so, you know, I know that perhaps we've come off here as having a particular point of view on the energy companies, but I want to say in their defense that they have contractual obligations to produce a certain amount of energy, which means they have some limitations on the design changes that they can make. And we take that realistic view into our discussions with the company. We've not had a single discussion with any wind developer that has had us at the table for any client, whether it's a historic community or Native American tribe, saying, we're here to kill your wind farm. It has all been about the edges. Can you do something to reduce this so that it's not as problematic for people who come to the island or people who live on the or people who live on the island, to your point earlier. And so maybe my colleagues have more to add to that, but yes, there's plenty of design data and simulations at various heights, but the reality is that there are only a couple of companies that produce these turbines in the world. There are only a couple of ships that ship them. So as the gentlemen who work in this industry can tell you, there are constraints that in theory could be changed, but there are contracts in place already that in practicality limit what the company can do. However, it does not mean that the company can do nothing. That's the point.
Yeah, just to add, it was a really good question. The trend technologically is toward taller turbines, which we've seen in our experience during these various projects. Every time there's a new construction and operations plan, the turbines are higher. And there is a correlation between height and the number of gigawatts produced. I'd be happy to get you that number, but it would just take me a little time to research it later today.
And I want to ask my colleague Claire a question because I, especially in the press's room, try not to talk unless I know what I'm talking about. On this simulation at for Sunrise, are these the turbines at the maximum possible height that the contract would allow, or the current projected height? And I ask that because the way in which the companies do the contracts is they say to the public, this turbine will be 850 feet tall, but it gives them room as technology develops to increase it to say by 33% without violating the contract. So what I've forgotten, I confess, is I don't know if these are as currently projected or what they could grow to be.
They're the currently projected.
So bottom line is what you're seeing here could grow in height, in theory, in some of these projects by 30% from the simulation that the companies provided in height. Other questions?
Anybody else? Thank you all very much for coming. Everybody who commented. It's a challenge. I mean, it's a challenge. So we'll figure it out together.
I would just like to say thank you for the invitation to present. And I want to especially thank those folks who made comments that might be interpreted as a critical position. I would really, because that helps us understand and respond to things that maybe we hadn't thought about. And I want to invite everyone again to be in touch with us directly. If there's information that you have access to that you think we don't, please provide it. And if there's information that we can get for you so that you can feel more informed, we will do our best to get that information for you. I want to thank the council again. Right.
I can't access the email on my computer, but
So just before everybody walks out, just to make clear, we're gonna meet in closed session. Because it'll be a discussion of potential litigation strategy, just that's what we do. And we'll in accordance with the rules and I think the three of our desires to have as much information as possible, the public will say everything we can as soon as we come out. So, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Sven, can you make a motion to put us into closed session, please?
So moved.
Neil, can you second? All those in favor indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no.
Would you just hear that?
It was terrific.
Well, after.
Interesting about this one is this. Soon. The medium term.
Yeah, but
Yeah, I don't want to.
Oh, that's. I mean, easiest thing is.
Yeah. I was a lobbyist, so.
There was. No.
Yeah, we'll get a lot of these.
especially after I write now.
Right.
Right. But you said does it right if it's all competitive?
No, well, I just had an email saying I think it's unfair. The girls who did the right thing, why should we be level rate instead of the fastest and follow the rules? Right. It's not like you're qualifying for.
Oh, I'm still in Zoom.
No. No, that's the.